We tell you now of a woman of 51 years who stood in the frost of a Dakota Territory morning with nothing left to her name but a carpetbag, a woolen shawl, and the small, hard coins she had sewn into the hem of her only good dress. Her name was Adelia Vance, and 3 weeks before, the man who held the mortgage on her husband's farm had ridden out to her gate himself to tell her the land was no longer hers. Cyrus Ashworth, president of the First Territorial Bank of Winter's Bend, had watched from his buggy as she carried her last box out the door, and he had not once climbed down to help her lift it. With $43 to her name, Adelia did the only thing that made any sense to a woman with nowhere else to go. She walked into that same bank 2 days later and, for $9, bought the one property on their foreclosure list that no one else wanted, a crumbling, frost-blackened icehouse on the edge of town that had stood empty and forgotten for 11 years. Folks called it a fool's purchase. They did not know that beneath its frozen floor lay something sealed away that would not only change the rest of Adelia's life, but would quietly, patiently, save the whole of Winter's Bend from a ruin far greater than her own. Settle in, and let us tell you the story of Adelia Vance. If you are watching this from a place that has been written off by everyone else, tell us where you're watching from in the comments, we would love to know. Adelia had been born Adelia Marsh, in the spring of 1837, in a snug timber house at the edge of a Wisconsin logging town, the second daughter of a locksmith named Ezra Marsh and a quilter named Ruth. Her father's shop smelled always of oil and iron filings, and from the time she was old enough to hold a tool without dropping it, he let her sit at his bench and watch the insides of locks reveal themselves to her, the tumblers, the springs. The small hidden logic of a thing built to keep its secrets until the right hand came along. Every lock wants to be opened by someone, he used to tell her, turning a stubborn mechanism over in the lamplight, it's only waiting for patience instead of force. Her mother taught her a different kind of patience, piecing quilts from flour sacks and worn shirt collars and the frayed ends of things other households threw away, showing Adelia how a square of cloth nobody wanted could be turned, set beside another, and made part of something whole and warm. Between the two of them, Adelia grew into a woman who could not look at a broken or discarded thing without wondering, quietly, what it might still be good for. She married Thomas Vance when she was 22, a steady, soft-spoken man with sun-browned forearms and a gift for coaxing wheat out of stubborn ground, and together they followed the promise of cheap land west, arriving in the young settlement of Winter's Bend, Dakota Territory, in the spring of 1867, when the town was little more than a trading post, a church, and a scatter of sod houses along a slow-moving creek. They built their farm from nothing, the way most families there had, through backbreaking seasons of drought and grasshopper years and winters so bitter that the whole town leaned on each other simply to survive until the thaw. It was in those early winters that Adelia first came to know Halvor Larsson, the broad-shouldered Norwegian who cut ice from the creek each January and packed it in sawdust in the icehouse he had built himself at the edge of town, selling blocks of it through the summer so the settlement might have cool water and preserved meat even in the worst heat. Halvor was known for two things, his tireless work, and his insistence, in those hungry founding years, that the families of Winter's Bend pool a small portion of whatever they could spare into what he called the mutual aid chest. So that no family who suffered a bad harvest or a death or a fire would be left entirely alone. Adelia remembered, as a young wife, dropping coins into that chest herself, remembered the quiet pride of it, the sense that the town was something larger than any one household's fortune. Thomas and Adelia raised no children who lived past infancy, a grief they carried together without ever quite speaking its full weight aloud, and instead poured their care into the farm and into each other, into a marriage that was less passionate than it was faithful, the kind that deepens slowly like a well-dug true. Thomas often said Adelia had more patience in her hands than any man he'd met, watching her mend harness leather or reset a hinge or piece together a quilt from the year's worn-out clothing with the same unhurried attention her father had once given his locks. It was, in its way, a good life, plain and hard and full, and Adelia never imagined it could be taken from her whole. The trouble began, as it so often does, with a run of bad years that were not entirely anyone's fault. A dry summer in 1885 was followed by a harder one in 1886, and then, in the winter of 1887, a blizzard came down out of the north so sudden and so cruel that it took half of Thomas's cattle before he could get them under shelter, and it took something in Thomas himself as well, he came in from that storm coughing blood into his handkerchief, and though he lingered through the following spring, he did not see another harvest. Adelia buried her husband in the small cemetery behind the Winters Bend Church in April of 1888, beside the 2 small stones of the children she had lost, and she came home from his funeral to a farm mortgaged past its worth and a bank that had, in the 2 years prior, quietly changed hands from old Mr. Hollis, who had known Thomas's father, to a younger man from the East named Cyrus Ashworth, who spoke of foreclosure the way other men spoke of the weather, as an unfortunate but unavoidable fact of business. Adelia tried everything a widow in her position might try. She sold what stock remained. She took in mending and sold quilts at the mercantile. She asked Ashworth, humbly and then less humbly, for time, reminding him that Thomas had never once missed a payment before the blizzard year, that the debt was small against a lifetime of honest work. Ashworth listened to her with his hands folded on his desk and his face arranged into an expression of practiced sorrow, and then he foreclosed anyway, in the autumn of 1888, along with 4 other farms belonging to families Adelia had known for 20 years. There were whispers around Winters Bend that Ashworth was not merely collecting on debts but hungrily consolidating land, buying up foreclosed farms cheap through a cousin in Yankton and reselling them at a profit to newcomers from the railroad line, but whispers do not stop a bank, and no one had proof, and everyone was too frightened of losing what little they had left to say such things aloud. Adelia packed her life into a wagon borrowed from a kind neighbor, sold the wagon and the horse both for traveling money, and stood on the steps of the bank with $43 sewn into her hem, uncertain whether she was about to leave Winters Bend forever or find some way, however small, to stay. It was in the bank's foreclosure ledger, posted in the window for public notice, that she saw the old Larson Icehouse listed among the properties to be sold, Halvor Larson having died in a fall on the ice years before, his family having sold the ice business and moved back east not long after, and the building itself having sat unclaimed and untaxed and forgotten ever since. More liability than asset to a bank that had no use for a crumbling shed of a building good for nothing but storing ice. Nobody sold any more. The asking price was $9. And Ashworth himself, seeing Adelia's name on the ledger, had smiled the thin smile of a man doing a small kindness he did not believe would cost him anything, and told her she was welcome to it if she was fool enough to want it. Adelia thought of her father's locks, of things other people gave up on too quickly, and she paid the $9 from her hem before she could talk herself out of it. The Icehouse stood at the edge of town where the creek bent north, a squat structure of thick sod walls and a heavy timber roof built low to the ground the way Halvor had built all his structures, for warmth against summer and cold against winter both. The door hung crooked on one hinge, and inside, the air struck Adelia at once as strange, colder than the autumn afternoon outside had any right to explain, and carrying a mineral, earthen smell that reminded her, oddly, of well water. Sawdust lay in dark, matted drifts across the floor, the remnants of decades of packed ice long since melted and gone, and in the far corner, half buried under that sawdust, she found a rusted iron ring set flush into a square of planking that did not match the rest of the floor. She might have thought it nothing, an old drain, perhaps, or a forgotten tool cache, had her father's training not made her the sort of woman who could not leave a thing like that unexamined. She knelt in the cold and the dark and pulled, and the plank came up stiff and complaining, revealing beneath it not earth, as she expected, but a narrow stair of fitted stone leading down into a cellar Adelia had never heard mentioned by a single soul in 20 years of living in Winters Bend. She did not go down that first day. The light was failing, and she had, after all, nowhere else to be that night but the small back room of the Icehouse itself, which she swept out and made as livable as she could with what little she'd carried, and she told herself she would explore properly by daylight. But she lay awake a long while on her cot listening to the wind find the gaps in the old walls, thinking of Halvor Larson, who she remembered as a careful, quiet man not given to waste, and wondering why a builder of his sense would dig a hidden cellar beneath an icehouse and tell no one. By the grey light of the following morning, Adelia went down the stone stair with a borrowed lantern, counting 11 steps before her feet found level ground, and there, in a chamber no larger than a modest parlor, cut into the earth and lined with the same fitted stone as the stair, she found what Halvor Larson had hidden. Against the far wall sat an iron strongbox, its lock long since rusted solid, and beside it, wrapped in oiled canvas that had kept the damp mostly at bay, a leather-bound ledger and a bundle of letters tied with twine gone brittle as old rope. Adelia's hands, trained since girlhood on stubborn locks, worked at the strongbox for the better part of an hour before the mechanism finally gave, and inside she found silver coin, not a fortune by the standards of Eastern banks, but a substantial sum for a frontier town, some $340 in careful, worn coin, along with a smaller pouch of gold pieces set apart from the rest. But it was the ledger that made her sit back on her heels in the cold and the lantern light and understand, slowly, what she was looking at. The ledger, written in Halvor Larsson's own careful, foreign-schooled hand, was the account book of the Winters Bend Mutual Aid Chest, the very fund Adelia herself had contributed to as a young bride, the fund every founding family of the town had built together out of the belief that no household should face ruin alone. Entry after entry recorded small deposits from families whose names Adelia still knew, the Hollisters and the Pratts and the Osgoods, each contribution noted with the date and the reason a family had once needed to draw from it, a barn rebuilt after fire, a widow's winter provisions, a doctor's bill paid for a sick child. And then, near the ledger's final pages, in an entry dated the autumn of 1877, Halvor's hand grew tighter, more urgent, and Adelia read, with a chill that had nothing to do with the cellar's cold, his account of a night when a stranger had come to him claiming authority from the Territorial Bank to collect the fund for safekeeping in their new vault, a young clerk new to Winters Bend by the name of Cyrus Ashworth. Halvor had refused him, distrusting the arrangement, and had instead moved the fund himself, in secret, to this cellar beneath his icehouse floor, telling no one but intending, his final entry read, to reveal it to the town council come spring. He never got the chance. Halvor Larsson died on the ice that January, and the fund, along with the truth of where it had gone, died with him, while the very man he had refused, the young clerk Cyrus Ashworth, had let the town believe for 11 years that Halvor himself had stolen it, a rumor that had shamed the Larsson name so thoroughly his widow and children left Winters Bend within the year and never spoke of the place again. The letters, when Adelia untied them with careful fingers, only confirmed what the ledger implied. They were letters between Halvor and Mr. Hollis, the old banker before Ashworth's time, in which Halvor described his unease at Ashworth's persistent and increasingly insistent visits, his sense that something about the young clerk's eagerness for the fund did not sit right, and his growing suspicion, never proven, but plainly, painfully felt, that Ashworth meant to use the town's own mutual trust against it. Adelia sat a long while in that cold stone room with the lantern guttering low, and thought of the man who had smiled his thin smile and let her buy this building for $9, thinking he was rid of a worthless liability, and she understood, with a clarity that felt almost like grief, that she was holding in her lap the truth that could clear a good man's name 11 years too late, and the means, perhaps, to keep history from swallowing the rest of Winters Bend the same way it had swallowed Halvor Larsson. She did not act rashly. Adelia Vance had spent too many years watching her father work a stubborn lock to believe that force, applied too soon, ever opened anything cleanly. She spent the better part of a week quietly confirming what the ledger told her, walking to the small county recorder's office in the town hall and asking, with careful, unremarkable questions, after the old land and business records from Halvor Larsson's time, finding there a faded notice from 1877 in which the fledgling Winters Bend Mutual Aid Society had indeed been dissolved for want of its treasurer, one H. Larsson, deceased, and its funds recorded simply as unrecovered. She spoke, gently and without explaining why, to old Mrs. Osgood, one of the few founding family women still living in town, and asked what she remembered of the fund and of Halvor's disappearance from town life before his death. Mrs. Osgood's eyes filled at the memory, and she told Adelia that it had broken her heart when the rumors started, that she had never quite believed a man as careful and as kind as Halvor Larsson would steal from his neighbors, but that in a small town, once a story like that takes root, no one thinks to question it twice. It was during that same week that Adelia first noticed Cyrus Ashworth's attention turning toward her again, not with kindness this time, but with a wary, watchful curiosity, for word travels fast in a small town, and someone had mentioned to him that the widow Vance had been seen going in and out of the old Icehouse at strange hours, and asking questions at the recorder's office about matters 11 years gone. Ashworth rode out to the Icehouse himself on a cold afternoon in November, ostensibly to see how she was settling into her little purchase, and The conflict that followed did not come as a single dramatic confrontation but as a slow tightening, the way a frost tightens over a pond before it will bear weight. Ashworth began, subtly at first, to make Adelia's continued presence in Winter's Bend difficult, questioning the legality of her purchase, sending a clerk to insist she owed back taxes on the Icehouse property that predated her ownership, hinting to the mercantile owner that credit extended to the widow Vance might not be wise given her unsettled situation. Adelia understood, watching this small campaign unfold, that Ashworth suspected she knew something, though she had told no one yet the full truth of what lay beneath her floor, and she understood too that a man capable of what the ledger described would not hesitate to find some legal maneuver to seize the Icehouse back from her the moment he judged it worth the trouble. She was, after all, only a widow with $9 worth of claim on a building the bank had been glad to be rid of, and Ashworth was the president of the only bank for 40 miles, with lawyers in Yankton and friends among the territorial officials who oversaw such disputes. Adelia's first instinct, and it shamed her a little to admit it even to herself, was fear, not for the money in the strongbox, which she had never once considered keeping for her own comfort, but for the letters and the ledger, the only proof that existed of what had truly happened to Halvor Larsen and the town's trust 11 years before. She spent one anxious night convinced Ashworth might come with men and a legal notice and simply take the building from her before she could act, and it was in the depth of that fear that she thought of her mother, piecing quilts from scraps other households discarded, finding a way to turn small, overlooked things into something too solid and too whole to easily be taken apart. She did not need force. She needed patience, and she needed witnesses. Adelia spent the following days moving carefully. She first went to Mrs. Osgood again, and to two other elderly residents who remembered the founding years clearly, Judge Elias Pratt among them, a retired circuit judge who had helped write the original charter of the Mutual Aid Society and whose memory, though slowed by age, was still sharp on matters of law and record. She showed them, in the privacy of Judge Pratt's parlor, the ledger and the letters, watching the old judge's face change as he read Halvor's careful hand, watching him set down his spectacles at last and say, quietly, that he had always wondered about the suddenness of the rumors against Halvor Larsen, that they had never sat easy with him even at the time. It was Judge Pratt who advised her that the safest course was not to confront Ashworth privately, where he might simply deny everything and use his influence to discredit her, but to bring the matter before the town in open meeting, with the ledger, the letters, and the recorder's own dissolution notice as evidence that could not be quietly buried the way Halvor's reputation had been. The town meeting was called for the second Sunday of December, in the same church hall where Adelia had buried her husband 8 months before, and word of it spread through Winter's Bend in the particular, unstoppable way that word travels through a small place when everyone senses, without quite knowing why, that something important is about to be said aloud. Nearly the whole town turned out, farmers and their wives, the mercantile owner, the schoolteacher, even a handful of the newer families who had bought foreclosed land from Ashworth's cousin and did not yet understand why the room felt so tense. Cyrus Ashworth came too, invited by the same notice as everyone else, seated near the front with his composed banker's face, plainly uncertain what this gathering concerned but unwilling to absent himself and appear as though he had cause to fear it. She turned the recovered fund, the $340 in silver, the pouch of gold set carefully aside, over to the town council that very night, asking only that it be used as Halvor had always meant it, for families in hardship, and she asked, further, that the council formally clear Halvor Larsen's name in the town record, a request Judge Pratt himself moved to approve before the meeting adjourned. In the weeks that followed, as word of the evening's revelations traveled to the territorial bank examiners in Yankton, an investigation was opened into Cyrus Ashworth's conduct, and though the full truth of his foreclosure dealings with his cousin took longer to untangle than the matter of Halvor's fund, Ashworth resigned his position at the First Territorial Bank before the spring thaw, and left Winter's Bend the way the Larsen family once had, quietly, without ceremony, under the weight of a reputation he had spent on others and could not now reclaim for himself. The restored fund, modest as it was, could not undo every foreclosure Ashworth had signed, but the new bank management, chastened and watched now by the territorial examiners, worked with the town council to extend fairer terms to families still struggling. Adelia's own small farm's fate settled at last with a portion of the fund itself, allowing her, if she chose, to reclaim a corner of what she'd lost, though by then, she found she no longer wished to. We return, as we so often do, to where a story begins, because it is only from there that its true shape can be seen whole. Adelia Vance had stood on the bank steps with $43 sewn into her hem and bought, for 9 of them, a building no one else wanted, believing at the time that she was simply keeping herself from having nowhere at all to sleep. She could not have known that the same patience her father had taught her at his locksmith's bench, the same eye for value her mother had taught her over scraps of worn cloth, would lead her down 11 stone steps to a truth that had waited, frozen and silent, for someone willing to kneel in the cold and pull up an old iron ring instead of walking past it. Halvor Larsson had built his hidden cellar not for treasure's sake but for trust's sake, believing his neighbors' small, shared sacrifices deserved to be protected even from the very institution meant to safeguard them, and it took another woman with nothing left to lose to finally carry that trust the rest of the way to where it belonged. Adelia chose, in the end, to stay on at the old Icehouse rather than reclaim her former farm, restoring the building slowly over the following years, filling it not with ice but with a modest lending library and a meeting room the town council used for its business, a place, she liked to say, where nothing that mattered would ever again be allowed to sit forgotten and misunderstood for 11 long years. Thank you for spending this hour with Adelia Vance and the quiet, frozen secret that waited so patiently beneath her floor. If her story moved you, we'd be grateful if you'd share it with someone who might need reminding that the things, and the people, written off too quickly by the world are so often worth a second, closer look. We'd love to hear from you before you go. What is a time you found real value in something, or someone, that everyone else had already given up on? Tell us in the comments below. We read every one, and we love hearing where these stories find you. Until next time, stay close.